Hello, my loyal subjects, and welcome! Today we're going to be talking about materials and how to actually organize using my physically based shading system. We're actually going to talk about how to construct layered materials. And moreover, we're just going to talk about how materials, how we actually compose materials using these nodes. So, in the previous tutorials, we covered how to implement a Fresnel node, which would actually take into account things like roughness, so that as roughness increased, it would vanish away. We then covered how to make that a little bit more robust by adding a rim shading option for things like metallics, which have an edge tint. Then we also went in and made it a little bit easier to use by actually going in and stripping out the lowest reflection. This way we can mix in our own. So with all this in mind, we can actually dive in and start playing around with our actual shading. So the next thing, of course, we covered was our reflections, and we went and assembled a lovely little reflection node out of that. With this, we actually created a layer of reflection we can throw over something. Now, I want to kind of clarify, I want to go a little bit more in depth and explain how the different elements actually fit together and when they fit together. So if we think about it from the perspective of light, again, this is all about light, materials interacting with it. That's why materials look the way they do. We've got our particle of light or our beam of light going through the air, and then it enters a surface. Like plastic, that is a wad of particles. Plastic particles, in this case, it's a think of it like just a big, dense glob of plastic, which is kind of what this is right now. Or maybe it's rubber, or maybe it's whatever material. Almost every material just sums up to a wad of particles. Few exceptions, but for the most part, there are only a few different kinds of materials. Now, where does the reflection come in? Because we know that light scatters through those particles. Well, reflection is the resistance from the light going from air, a very, very thin, unobtrusive medium, to something very, very thick like plastic, which suddenly starts slowing it down a ton. So it becomes, that bouncing off is actually where, that kind of grazing off, and that resistance is the Fresnel effect. And that's where we actually get our reflection. So the idea is, our material is diffuse, it is a wad of particles, and you can think of this like a very, very dense smoke cloud. Matter of fact, if you went and added volume scatter, which I'm not going to do because I don't feel like crashing my computer today, if you made that super, super dense, it would basically become a diffuse shader like this. So anyway, the reflections come from traveling through the border of air and then going to plastic. That transition, it's not always easy. It's a bit like skipping a stone off a lake. Like, the stone has to actually travel from air to water, and there's resistance in there, and the same goes for light. So that's where these reflections come from and the bouncing off. And it makes it a little bit more interesting when we think about how this actually, how we actually assemble materials now. So we've got stuff like diffuse, but we can also look at it for stuff like glass. So glass bends the light. As you can see, it goes, and it lets light pass through it. So if I say IOR of 1, for example, it just passes through. I'm using a little shading trick that blurs out the background, but honestly this wouldn't look like anything if it, this would not look like anything if I didn't have this shading trick on. It would look nearly invisible other than these random black lines that come from error on Blender's part, where Blender's basically just running out of samples to do. It's basically just saying, okay, this light's bouncing around too much, we're going to kill it now. So anyway, it's going from air to this material that is slightly different and bends the light. And the way we actually display that border, through a reflection. And then we have glass. And as you can see, we have our lovely, lovely little glass shader now. And I can even give it a little bit of a tint if I want. But this is how we will assemble materials using our physically based shading system, in order to create some very, very accurate materials, but also as a general rule for making it very, very simple to work with. So, so now that we have the basics of how we compose materials, let's think about the one kind of exception to the rule. Much like the Mongols, metallics are always the exception. So as a result, because of the way metallics work, and because of the way they interact with light, they have a tendency to reflect a lot more light than most materials. They're very, very hard to enter into. Light has a tendency to bounce back, and if the surface is particularly bumpy, it has a tendency to scatter that light. Some of it will get bounced back more than others, creating a tint in the metal, and this kind of stuff makes it very, very easy to create materials using this. So you can think of this like, this is already kind of the border. We're just saying it's a metallic material, so the border is super visible, you know, because that's what's doing the majority of the shading for us. But we can also use this to perform approximations. Because, for example, let's say I want to make a car paint. Well, part of the way that car paint looks is based on the factor that it's usually not just one layer of material. It's usually something like a rough metallic layer. For example, if I went and selected like a, I don't know, we'll go for a reddish. We'll go for kind of a reddish material. So let's say a dark, rough metal. You know, we've got this kind of dark, rough metal that we're playing with. And this looks fine and dandy, but we can make it look a little bit better if we just take this one step further. So most car paint isn't just raw, rough metal, the kind of spray-painted metal. They usually spray on another layer over it, referred to as a clear coat. This is a thin layer of transparent, usually some kind of plastic, that's generally meant to protect the paint, but it has the other effect of also making it look very, very pretty. So you've got this lovely soft metal, and then, you know, this kind of rough metal looking stuff, and then we have a reflection. This reflection is caused by the light going from air into the clear coat, and then it goes into the metal, which triggers the metal shading. So, as a result, we have metallic, and we have a reflection. Look at that. Now, because we added this specular control, it's much easier if we increase our specular to make it more reflective or make it less reflective as needed. In my case, I'm actually going to make it slightly less reflective because I am actually going to make this a little bit lighter. Make this a little bit more subtle. Just so that we can see more of that undercoat. This is a personal preference of my own. Not necessarily physically accurate, but quite nice. None the same. Or nonetheless, rather. Yeah, none the same. Where the hell did that even come from? Anyway, but yeah, this is how we can assemble materials, is generally by thinking of them in layers. And this kind of makes the whole process of making materials quite easy. However, it can still be somewhat complicated when we're dealing with more sophisticated materials. So we kind of have to keep in mind how these transitions work. It goes from, you know, if we have a material with layers, we have to remember that light's going from one layer, hitting, interacting with it in whatever way it happens to, and then going in and interacting again. So, for example, when we're approaching materials like skin, and I'm not going to completely cover a material like skin because it's very, very complicated, but you can actually think of it like layers of flesh, all with different properties. We've got, like, way down here, we have one type of layer, and I don't remember all the names, but it was like dermis, epidermis, and basically what I think of them as blood, you know, lower flesh and upper flesh kind of stuff. But then again, I need to actually look up the real terms for it and do more research on it. But you can think of these different layers, and you can think of the light actually going in, reflecting off, and also having to reflect off the lower layers, and then also having to scatter through the upper layers again. And this can create some pretty sophisticated behavior. So, as a result, when you're dealing with certain materials that are complexly layered, like skin, it can often be significantly more complicated than just throwing a subsurface scattering node and a reflection node together in the same place. But it still works quite well to actually have them rendered in this way. And I'm just going to render a small vertical slice here to avoid my computer completely exploding or just swearing at me loudly. So you can see here where we can actually create some pretty sophisticated materials with a matter of 2 nodes. All of these are pretty much 2 nodes. But we also need to think about certain elements of the materials themselves, because sometimes we need to take into account the volume of the material, and this is kind of the final element of physical materials, especially glass. So if I had refraction real quick, and we add it, and I can actually full screen this again, and we go in here and we add a reflection over top, and you know, we add a reflection over top, we can actually go ahead and take into account one element of glass. So with certain types of plastic, what they'll generally do is they'll tint the surface layer, and that's kind of what this refraction color does. It just tints the color the moment it goes in. This will give you kind of a plastic look, but it's not really like a real glass look. And you might not necessarily notice the difference right off the bat. I mean, there are plenty of glass types that are tinted this way. It can be hard to tell. However, if we make this white real quick, and we go in here, and we go into shader, volume absorption, this is honestly one of my favorite nodes to mix in with glass. So what we can actually do is we can go for volume absorption. And if we go and make it very, very dense, and black, we can see that the thin areas are still kind of visible. We can sort of see through the collar here, we can sort of see through the arm. You can see it's still visible to it's still visible enough to see through it, but the thicker areas accumulate a lot of the color. And this is important because this is actually how real-world materials have a tendency to work, and you'll see this a lot in real-world materials where they'll actually accumulate color in this way. So we can actually go ahead and add a strong tint to it, and then do something like make it very, very, very dense. So we can actually go in, and once we've created that very, very dense material, we can actually play around with some of the gradients. And it's fun when you start playing with these in combination. Like if I make this slightly yellowish, and then I make the absorption through it very red. See if I can get this thing to actually recognize. But you can see here, we get this lovely gradient from yellowish in the thin areas to orange in the thicker areas, and this kind of stuff can be really, really fun to play with and get really gorgeous materials with, and it can just help you get that extra, you know, kind of zazz out of your materials, and honestly it just looks very, very pretty. So yeah, with 3 simple nodes. Now the final thing I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about on a tiny little vertical slice, and sorry if you can't see this, but I'm currently recording, and recording is pretty intensive, and combine that with rendering and also the factor that my computer, the problem isn't even that my computer will putter out or anything, it's that the audio will desync. It's that the audio will desync from the video, get garbled or something like that. So I need to be kind of careful with this. I'm going to warn you right now that I'm going to restart the recording real quick, and if this video just kind of has a weird segment after it, expect it if it goes badly. So, now let's talk. So one of the things I want to talk about with volume is how you actually combine the 2 volume modes. And what is volume scatter? So volume scattering is the idea that there are little particles in your material. Little particles that exist in your material that when your light goes in and bounces around inside, it will interact with. These can scatter the light slightly. This is why this is called volume scatter. Volume scatter is designed for things like smoke, and if we just render it with only volume scatter, you'll see we get this kind of smoky volume to it. And if I make it more dense, you'll actually see it kind of becomes almost a diffuse. And you can see it kind of looks like a very, very dense smoke cloud. And if I make it very, very dense, we almost get a diffuse look. It almost looks like a diffuse shader. And if I go in here, there's a funny little thing you can do with materials, which is you can go under here, under settings on your material, and check homogeneous. This will make it render significantly faster, and also make it less likely to just explode, killing everybody. Now, this volume color can be deceptive. Make this white. That is how much light it scatters in any given direction. So for example, if I make this orange, you'll notice it becomes like this weird tinge. This is closer to the scattering, this is closer to the radius setting for subsurface scattering. I think it's called radius. Yeah, radius. This is basically what we're talking about with volume scatter, and this is kind of inconsistent. I don't particularly like that it's inconsistent, but hey, as you do. So, anyway, as you can see here, this is sort of, you know, your basic smoky material. And how do we make this look kind of diffuse-ish as well? Because diffuse materials do. Well, we can do it with a transparent shader. Because this is actually, it's tinting it the moment it contacts the surface. So, here we can get kind of a red diffuse. And this is how volume scatter is. This is more of a physical simulation. This is the kind of stuff that Maxwell does. And this is the kind of stuff that's really, really important when you're actually rendering stuff that is not entirely solid. So, for example, if I set this down to 1, you can actually kind of see through it. And, you know, to a certain degree, you can see through it. And it kind of scatters what you can see. And that's kind of an interesting factor about things. You know, it's kind of an interesting approach. So, next. So we've got our glass, right? And we can use volume scatter. So I can say, like, volume scatter in here, and it makes it kind of a smoky plastic. As I said, this can be a bit intensive and noisy as hell, as you can see. But it sort of creates this smoky look inside your material that can be really cool looking in the right hands. And how do we combine these? Well, it's actually really, really straightforward. The way you combine them is via an add shader. And this doesn't make a huge amount of sense because almost everything else, the physical correct way, is to literally mix them. But in this case, add shader is literally how Blender deals with the idea of having both properties in a material. It's kind of strange, but yes, it's actually running both. It's running both and dealing with both. So, yeah, it's absorbing and it's scattering. So, for example, if I add this, and I go up and add a little bit of scattering, you can see we get this kind of smoky but absorption-filled material that looks kind of nice. Again, noisy as hell. These generate tons of noise and are generally pretty intensive, to say the least. You know, it's taking quite a while to render even 32 frames, or samples of these, but yeah, you can kind of get an impression of what that is, what that looks like. Hopefully. But you can kind of see here where it's actually going and where the material is going. So this is how you make materials that are very complex volumetrically. So you can see here we've got a scattering material in here, and we have a little bit of absorption, we've got a little bit of surface tint. We've made this really complicated material, but only with about 5 nodes. You know, we're only up to like 5 nodes here. So this is how you actually compose materials using the physically based shaders that I've actually constructed for you. Now, of course, once you actually bring texturing and everything into this, it gets more complicated, but I mean, even that is pretty straightforward. And as usual, go check out 3D Bandit if you want to know how to do these kind of procedural textures and really make him sing, because he's really, really good at that. For now, I'm just going to do a basic Verneuil displacement because... And I'm also going to remove some of the volumetric effects because I like having a frame rate. So, yeah, I mean, beyond that, this is basically how you construct the shading. This is how you can actually assemble materials using them. And hopefully this has cleared up some of the confusion regarding how to actually assemble materials with these. So you can take it and layer it and so on. And it's just made it a little bit more clear of where we put reflections and why. So again, we can use it for approximations, we can use it for just cool visual effects if we want, and again, hopefully it should just make your material composition just that little bit easier when you're actually assembling materials. So if I go in here and say vector, bump, and just the final little tidbit here, so I'm just going to 256. Maybe significantly more than that. Let's do kind of a, I don't know, let's do a bumpy, let's try to make this thing look like leather real quick. Let's just go ahead and, maybe foam. We'll do kind of a weird handle foam. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but whatever, we'll go for diffuse, reflection since it's a non-metallic. It's a basic dielectric material. So we'll kind of go for a dark color, kind of rough, you know, a little bit rough, so we kind of get this material, and then we'll go and bump it a little bit. And yeah, so here is our little noisy bumps, and then I'm just going to... I'm going to actually make these a little bit sharper, so I'm going to say power of 3 to make them a little bit sharper. And they're currently indenting, which I don't want. If I zoom in here, you can see they're actually indenting into the surface. I actually want them pumping out of the surface, so they're these little bubbles, almost like it's made of foam or whatever. So yeah, then we can preview our material, and it'll be overly bumpy, but you can see where my intent is going. And yeah, so let's just make that a lot weaker. And you can see we've got ourselves a lovely little foam material. There, for some reason we have a foam death machine sculpt thing. So yeah, hopefully this has made your material composition just a little bit easier, and I know I have a tendency to add little tidbits at the end of my videos that aren't strictly to do with the tutorial, but I don't know, maybe it's useful to some of you to kind of see how the how you can just kind of plug stuff in and assemble it. And in the next tutorial, I'm actually going to be covering how to make Uber shaders, and I don't really want to give away too much, but I am going to say that I have a secret for making Uber shaders that don't slow down your renders at all. And I mean at all, ever, because they're really, really awesome. Though they're not quite they're not quite the same as traditional Uber shaders. But anyway, I won't say any more. So yeah, thank you for watching. Peace out. And yeah, maybe if you have a friend or whatever who might be interested in seeing a tutorial of this nature, maybe share it somewhere or just tell someone about it. And yeah, thank you for watching, and if you want to see any more of my videos, you can go to my channel, should be on the bottom there, or wherever YouTube happens to put it these days. And yeah, you can also click the subscribe button if you want to see when I post new videos. I mean, beyond that, it's a lovely little feature that lets you see when I post new videos and so on. Yeah, that's about it. I'm gonna go drink stuff. Cthulhu Tahin! Peace out.